Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm with DNDI. My question is to Professor Chan? No. Yeah? Okay. You talked a lot about China. I had a little bit of experience with a foundation based in Hong Kong called Li Ka-shing Foundation that opened a medical school in China. Might he be influential in building this sense of philanthropy in China?
One of the things I wasn't able to go into because of the very, very limited time was the fact when you talk about China, it's not necessarily the same as talking about the Chinese. There's a huge Chinese diaspora, of course, and in places like Hong Kong, which does have a rather separate identity, as the students right now are trying to demonstrate in the streets of Hong Kong, and in Taiwan and in Singapore, you have major Chinese societies that do have independent identities while still linking themselves to a metropolitan China. But because they've had greater global exposures over the years, they have developed in those countries in particular far greater philanthropic organizations and the apparatus that needs to go with them. The impact of diasporic Chinese on practices in China as a metropolitan power, no one's been able to measure that as yet. It's very, very difficult to get the kind of data to do a scientific set of measures. But it is very, very clear there's a very great deal of interpenetration, and particularly in terms of circulation of capital, including possible philanthropic capital going into metropolitan China. As I say, we don't have the facts and figures, but I do think that as the years go by, and as metropolitan China seeks to modernize itself more and more rapidly, they will have to learn far, far more from the diasporic Chinese communities in philanthropy and in other sectors as well.
Thank you. I've just been corrected. Janssen don't own J&J. J&J own Janssen. So. Any questions from the floor? Uta. Oh. I'll take the two questions and then pass it back to the
I listened with great interest to the Janssen presentation. Sorry, I forgot your name. Karen, when you mentioned the pediatric formulation of mebendazole, I was looking to my colleague from TI Pharma. I think we had the same idea. Our consortium on the pediatric formulation of praziquantel is quite advanced. We have now a formulation in hands, an oral disintegrating tablet, which is in clinical development, and I think as a public-private partnership, what we can offer is to talk to your team and share our experience, because I would say we had quite some interesting expert meetings in the past about formulation.
So Julie Jacobson from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So it was very interesting from both Asian perspectives, from the Japanese and the Chinese, and BT and I have communicated on this idea since its inception, and it's very interesting to see your presentation of it and the justification of NTDs being part of the work because of the historical link of NTDs within the country. And I was wondering if there's a reflection on the future for China, because China has such a strong, had a lot of NTDs, but has had such a strong history of success in working with NTDs, that there could be a case made in a similar way for strong investment within China for the NTD pieces.
I think that what you've got in terms of Chinese involvement in various sectors is a major problem which is on the African side as much as on the Chinese side. And that is public health systems in many African countries. And this needs to be nuanced quite considerably, because there are 54 African countries, and not everyone is as downbeat as, let us say, Liberia, in terms of having no more than, let us say, last count, 53 qualified doctors in the whole country trying to deal with an Ebola outbreak. Other countries, as I say, have got greater infrastructure and greater personnel, but it does mean very, very much that no matter what therapies, what kind of treatments, what kind of provision of treatments you put into certain countries, there's not always going to be the capacity to uptake and distribute these therapies in a timely and, above all, in an equitable fashion. Now, I had a lot to do very, very much on a social welfare basis with the distribution of generics, not so much for NTDs, but for things like HIV, for instance, in different African environments. And even there, where you would have thought is a very, very straightforward protocol, very straightforward sort of set of treatments. The uptake was very, very difficult to control, both because of education, because of the reliability of provision of the therapies, and of course very, very much to do with the longevity of people willing to keep taking the treatments over a very, very great period of time. So all kinds of difficulties, and the Chinese are not the only ones who face these difficulties. I remember very, very much the one big public hospital in Lusaka in Zambia when I was living there. This was the premier elite institution. This was the medical training school as well. Went for 3 months without running water. I'm not really sure how you run a hospital without running water, but those are the conditions which have not totally disappeared. So you've actually got several multi-layered problems, and the provision of therapies, the provision of generics or whatever is only one side of it. Uptake, distribution, and capacity to maintain health systems. And I think the Ebola crisis in West Africa is very, very much only the latest example of a long-running saga in some of these countries. That requires a very, very great deal of attention and care, I would say.
Shall I add to that?
Yes, please.
Julie, I found your question very, very interesting in terms of China going forward. If you look, I mean, the fastest growing economy right now is China. If you look at the number of routes between China and Africa right now for not only China but Asia and Africa right now in terms of airplane routes and whatnot, it's increasing quite significantly. Which means that for Asia, in terms of stepping up on an economic route, an economic platform, probably within a decade, you're looking at many of the strongest economies worldwide. So even though there's a personal and historical factor with Japan and neglected tropical diseases, looking up and understanding kind of the step forward for global health for Japan, you could take the altruistic perspective, but you also could take the self-interest perspective. And that is to step up on that global platform and say you're going to invest in something for a long-term investment, saying that you have to invest as a country to global health issues, has a lot of benefits long-term for one's corporations, for one's government, as well as in terms of one's human security domestically, in terms of public health risks, especially when many of these diseases are going to be coming into or between China and Africa and between Asia and Africa. So in terms of an altruistic question, it's a matter of when will China step up in terms of a philanthropical approach or a charitable approach to global health R&D. But from a self-interest perspective, you could rephrase the question and say, when will China take on it in terms of looking at their own global health investment from a corporation as well as from a government perspective into this area?
Any other thoughts from the audience, please?
My name is Remco de Vru. I'm with TR Pharma. I have another question for Karen, because she said something else interesting. I was very impressed with the things that you're doing in China, which sounds to me like you're doing a lot of capacity building. So my question is, I'm sure you're aware that in Africa things don't stand still either, and they have within the African Union now the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan in which they want to build their own infrastructure, pharmaceutical innovation, manufacturing, etc. Do you foresee whether Janssen or any other pharmaceutical company is really moving into that area to really support that? Are there steps being undertaken? Can you comment on that, or will you get back to me on that?
So I think, yes, I mean, we see that Africa is moving into doing its own manufacturing. I mean, there's been quite a lot done in South Africa, and now I think it's gradually moving further north. In terms of what we're doing, I think one of the things that we've focused on, which will support the manufacturing, but is not directly the manufacturing piece, is in fact, we are one of the members of the African Regulatory Network. So it's a network of the regulatory offices from the various African countries, which comes to meet and says, how can we simplify the regulatory process within Africa? It is actually one of the biggest hurdles of getting drugs into the countries is to actually get them approved. In each of the 54 countries that Stephen mentioned, you have to go through the regulatory review process, and it can take from 6 months to 5 years, depending on which country you're going through, because they have very few experienced regulatory staff in their ministries. And so it's not bad will, it's just simply a lack of capacity. And you know, for them, there are huge numbers of drugs coming through that companies are now trying to get approved, whether it's for HIV or whether it's for cardiovascular disease. They're just simply overwhelmed. So the area that we're really working on is actually trying to say, okay, could you actually standardize it and streamline it? Now, there are all sorts of, let's say, sovereignty issues around this. Countries don't like giving up their choice. Do we approve, do we not approve? But they have seen that in the European Union, we now do have a centralized process for approval. That's not to say that it approves reimbursement and things like that. And so we are working with some of the regional groupings like SADC and things like that to say, okay, could you foresee a way that you could share some of this process? And so in the SADC group, they've actually started to carve it out and say, okay, we'll all still do some regulatory review, but one country will look at clinical, one country will look at manufacturing and formulation, one country will look at safety and pharmacovigilance. So they all still feel like they have some say in the process, but that really lifts the burden. So in answer, we're not working directly on the manufacturing piece, but indirectly recognizing that it's going to come, you know, regardless. And I think that it is the right thing because, you know, countries do need to, build capacity, but also by building that capacity, they actually understand the challenges of the process much more. So there's a learning, even if a country doesn't actually develop its own manufacturing facility, the fact that there are manufacturing facilities being developed on the continent helps them as a whole to understand and really engage with the process. So.
Thank you. Any more questions?
This one's for Dr. Slingsby. Because I've worked with EDCTP and we tried to get cash contribution from major pharmaceutical companies. So my question is, how do Japanese companies differ from what I would say European, US companies? That Japanese companies were willing to provide a cash contribution. Can you enlighten us how that process worked?
I'm not sure if it fundamentally differs by countries. I just think the initiative and the structure of our fund was set up in terms of that leveraging mechanism. And instead of to base that all on in-kind support, ties a thread between the funders and the product developers, where ours is cut, which means being a funder of our organization does not necessarily result in becoming a grantee. There's no tie between those two. But if you have a fund, the funders invest through in-kind donation, it's immediately that there's a thread between the funding and the grantees. And in my perspective, that's a conflict of interest. So the only way to sever that conflict of interest is through a cash donation and say that the decision-making process, the governance, the entire organization is separated from the funding, particularly in terms of private sector's contribution. And then that way, it's a little cleaner in terms of the decision-making that goes forward, in terms of investing. And I think through that, at least the relationships between and amongst our funders, as well as amongst our grantees, is a bit more simpler, because that's very transparent in terms of how we approach decision-making of our grants.
Good, thank you. Can I ask everybody just to thank the presenters for this session?